A retired soldier walked into the shelter. He didn't want a puppy. He asked for the one no one wanted, the one with scars, silence, and a warning sign on his cage. Echo didn't bark, didn't wag his tail. He just waited for nothing. But Ethan Walker, a former Marine battling his own invisible wounds, saw something no one else did. 2 broken souls. 1 final chance. What happened next will restore your faith in second chances. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far Echo's story reaches. The rain had settled into a slow, persistent rhythm, drumming lightly against the windshield of Ethan Walker's old Ford Bronco as he pulled into the gravel lot of the Ash Grove Animal Rescue Center. The sky was a cold slate gray, stretched low over the evergreens, and the air smelled faintly of moss, wet pine, and the quiet melancholy of early March. The shelter sat at the edge of town, small and unassuming, its paint peeling slightly and its porch light flickering with the tired breath of a place too often overlooked. Ethan stepped out, boots landing in a shallow puddle. He moved with the posture of a man who had once stood tall, but now bent slightly beneath weight unseen. At 34, his body was lean, hard, and sun-worn, with arms inked in faded military script and scars like forgotten maps across his forearms. His hair was short, almost military cut still, and his eyes, storm-colored and watchful, carried the kind of stillness only soldiers and statues shared. PTSD was an acronym stamped quietly across the files in his VA profile, but to Ethan, it was a ghost that never left his side, never blinked, never slept. The bell above the shelter door jingled with a half-hearted chime as he walked in. The air inside was warm, thick with the scent of antiseptic and damp fur. A woman behind the desk looked up, brushing a loose curl behind her ear as she rose. She was in her mid-20s, tall and slim, in a forest green hoodie with the shelter's logo embroidered over her heart. Her name tag read Maddie. Maddie Larson had worked at Ash Grove Rescue for nearly 3 years. Her hazel eyes were wide and soft, shaped like someone who smiled often, but not without sorrow. She had a faint scar along her collarbone, a reminder from the foster dog who had panicked during a thunderstorm. That incident hadn't scared her away. Instead, it had taught her to move slower, speak gentler, and never underestimate fear. Maddie had a way of listening with her whole body, like she could hear what wasn't said. "Hi there," she greeted with practiced warmth. "Looking to adopt today? We've got some adorable pups in the front runs, playful, trained, good with families." "I want the one no one wants," Ethan interrupted, his voice calm, low. He took off his cap, revealing weather-tanned skin and a small healing cut near his temple. The hardest one, the one people gave up on. There was a brief silence. Maddie blinked. "Sorry. What?" "The dog who's been here the longest, the one you've stopped showing to visitors," he said plainly. "That's the one I came for." Maddie hesitated. This wasn't the first time someone had asked for a challenge, but something about this man was different. He didn't carry bravado or arrogance. He carried something heavier, quieter, something she instinctively recognized. Still, her training kicked in. "They come with issues," she warned gently. "Behavioral scars, trust problems, maybe aggression. Sometimes they never come around. They aren't projects. They're just broken." "So am I," Ethan replied simply. She held his gaze for a long second, then nodded once and motioned him to follow. They walked down a narrow hallway lined with kennels. Dogs barked, some jumping excitedly against the metal grates, others whining, tails wagging in hopeful chaos. Tags were pinned to each kennel door, names in bold marker, age, status, little smiley faces drawn in yellow. They passed them all. At the very end, around a corner most visitors never bothered to walk, was a cage apart from the rest. It was dim, quieter, the concrete floor damp from an unnoticed leak. Inside lay a German shepherd, large and unmoving, curled in a half-moon shape with his back turned to the world. His fur was a mottled mix of rust and black, patchy in places, dull in others. One ear twitched at their approach, but he did not turn. "This is Echo," Maddie said softly. 6 years old. Came in from an abuse case about 19 months ago. Starved, beaten, muzzle scars. We tried placement 3 times. He growled, bit once. Got returned twice, and the third just left him outside our gates in the rain. He hasn't really responded to anyone since. Ethan crouched slowly beside the gate, eyes steady, voice quiet. Has anyone tried not expecting anything from him? Maddie opened her mouth, then closed it. Echo shifted, lifted his head an inch. His amber eyes met Ethan's for the first time. There was no spark of hope, no tail thump. Just weariness. Deep, marrow-deep weariness. "I'll take him," Ethan said. "Are you sure?" Maddie asked, more out of habit than doubt. She already knew the answer. Absolutely. It took nearly 20 minutes to coax Echo into the crate. He resisted every touch, flinched from every movement. Only Ethan's presence seemed to keep him from total panic. When they finally got him secured, Maddie slipped a leash and a starter kit across the counter. "You'll need patience," she said, handing him a folder with Echo's records. "I've been trained in that," Ethan replied dryly. His voice cracked a hint of humor for the first time. Before he left, Maddie looked once more at the large, silent figure in the crate. "I don't know what made you pick him," she admitted. "But thank you." "I didn't pick him," Ethan said, eyes on the road beyond the door. "He's the only one who'd understand me." The rain was still falling as he loaded Echo into the back of the Bronco. The dog pressed himself into the farthest corner, head low, eyes fixed on the door, body trembling. Ethan didn't speak. He just sat behind the wheel for a moment, one hand on the steering wheel, the other resting on the crate. Outside, Ash Grove's trees shivered under the spring rain, and somewhere behind them hope stirred like a whisper. The rain had slowed to a whisper by the time Ethan pulled the Bronco into the cracked driveway of his modest cabin on the outskirts of Ash Grove. Moss crawled up the edges of the wooden porch like it had been growing there for decades. The cabin was tucked against a backdrop of damp pines and alder trees, its windows fogged from the warmth inside. Home wasn't big. Just 1 floor, 2 bedrooms, a fireplace, and an old shed leaning into the tree line. But for Ethan, it was the only place since his discharge that didn't feel like a cage. He left the engine running as he opened the rear gate of the Bronco. Echo still cowered at the far corner of the crate, unmoving, except for the subtle tremor that rippled through his muscles. His eyes tracked Ethan's every move, but without fear or aggression, just a flat, practiced vigilance like a soldier who no longer expected rescue. Ethan didn't try to speak. He simply unlatched the crate, stepped back, and waited. Minutes passed. Echo didn't move. Eventually, Ethan carried the crate, still with Echo inside, into the laundry room. It was the quietest part of the house, painted in soft forest green with a single small window and a floor scattered with mismatched rugs. He opened the crate again and placed a bowl of fresh water and a scoop of high-protein kibble nearby. Echo didn't so much as sniff them. He remained curled in a tight coil head between his paws, ribs visible beneath his coarse fur. Ethan sat cross-legged just a few feet away, back against the wall, a paperback resting on his thigh. It was all quiet on the Western Front, a book he'd read 3 times, but couldn't seem to let go of. He didn't read aloud. He just read page after page, letting the quiet fall thick between them. The clock ticked, the dryer hummed gently, and outside the wind whispered through damp leaves. Echo didn't budge, but Ethan wasn't looking for movement. He was simply there. That first night, Echo didn't eat. He didn't drink. He didn't sleep either. Every few hours, Ethan would glance over and see the same alert tension in Echo's eyes, half dreaming, half awaiting danger. The cabin creaked with the sound of settling beams and distant thunder, but nothing disturbed Echo more than the occasional silence. It was the kind of silence that had once meant danger was near. By morning, Ethan brewed a cup of strong black coffee and scribbled something into the small spiral-bound notebook he kept in the drawer beside his recliner. The front page read, Echo, progress log. On the second line he wrote, Day 1. No food, no water, no eye contact, breathing shallow. Still. Waited in silence. He underlined the word waited. It was something he understood well. For Ethan, the notebook wasn't just about Echo, it was a reflection. Every entry he wrote mirrored the days he spent after deployment living, moment to moment, unable to sleep more than an hour at a time. The VA had given him pamphlets, therapy schedules, meds. None of them lasted longer than a few weeks. But now, with Echo, the days took on a strange sort of clarity, as if watching over the dog's recovery gave him a reason to monitor his own. On the third night, something shifted. It was subtle. Ethan had fallen asleep in the laundry room back against the dryer book closed in his lap. Moonlight leaked through the window, casting a pale pool of light across the floor. At some point past midnight, he stirred to a faint sound. Not a bark, not a growl, but the whisper of movement on worn wood. Echo had shifted. Not much. Just a small turn of the head, one paw unfurled, and his ears once pinned back, now tilted forward slightly. Barely anything but Ethan noticed. He sat up slowly, careful not to startle the dog. Echo didn't flinch. For the first time, the two of them looked at each other in stillness. No demands, no expectations, just breath and shared weight. Ethan didn't reach out. Instead, he whispered, I saw that. Then, as if marking the moment in his mind, he pulled out the notebook from his jacket pocket. Day 3, ears moved, head shifted. First sign of presence. Still afraid, but aware. Still waiting. That same day, while making a supply run to the town's general store, Ethan ran into an old acquaintance, Mrs. Eliza Grant, the widow who ran the second-hand bookstore on Main Street. She was in her early 70s, sharp-eyed, and always dressed in thick shawls no matter the weather. Eliza had been known in town for her dry wit and sharp memory. She could recite quotes from Hemingway better than most professors. Elijah said you came into the shelter, she said, pointing a crooked finger at Ethan while reaching for a can of tomato soup. Yeah, Ethan replied. Got myself a roommate. Her eyes narrowed, but not unkindly. Took the one they call Echo. He nodded. God bless your stubborn soul, she muttered. That one's got thunder buried in his bones. Ethan almost smiled. That night, back at the cabin, Echo still refused to leave the laundry room. But his eyes followed Ethan as he moved about. When Ethan sat down and started reading again, Echo's tail thumped once, barely audible, a whisper against the floor. Ethan didn't mention it aloud. Instead, he just added to the log Day 4, tail moved, brief eye contact, awareness increasing. Cautious, but less ghost. Progress didn't come in leaps, it came in inches. By the end of the week, Echo had repositioned himself to face Ethan rather than the wall. He didn't approach, didn't vocalize, but something about his posture had changed, less curled, more grounded. He drank a bit of water for the first time on day 6 when Ethan wasn't looking. The kibble remained untouched, but the bowl of water once full was now half empty. Ethan noted it with a checkmark in his log and a small star next to the date. The silence between them became something else. Not the haunted silence of trauma, but a patient one, ripe with possibility. Ethan still struggled to sleep, still awoke to echoes of mortar fire and shouted commands that weren't real. But when he sat in that green-walled room beside Echo, he didn't feel alone in it anymore, and maybe Echo didn't either. The rain had returned to Ashgrove in sheets tapping rhythmically against the tin roof of Ethan's cabin, like an anxious visitor who wouldn't leave. Thunder cracked low in the distance, a sound Ethan had long since learned to measure how far, how close, how loud. He lay twisted in the thin sheets of his bed, sweat dampening his shirt, his breathing ragged. Dreams had brought him back to the burning sun of Kandahar, to the smoke, and the screaming to the weight of a rifle, and the knowledge that someone he knew had just vanished into fire. His eyes shot open with a gasp, the room dark except for the weak glow of the wood stove in the adjacent living room. Rain and memory were hard to tell apart sometimes. He sat up slowly, head in his hands, heart pounding like distant artillery. The silence that followed was almost more unbearable than the nightmare itself. But then a sound, barely there. The scrape of claws against the hardwood floor. Ethan looked up. Echo stood in the doorway. The dog's posture was low, cautious, but he had left the laundry room on his own. In the pale orange light, his fur looked darker, damp with humidity, his form lean and tentative. Slowly, Echo crossed the threshold of Ethan's room, one paw then another, until he stood beside the bed. There was no wag of the tail, no excited whine. Only a gentle movement as Echo lowered his head and rested it against Ethan's bare leg. Ethan didn't move. He couldn't. His breath caught in his throat, not from fear, but from something stranger, more raw. Connection. After a week of silence, after hours spent reading in vain and journaling empty progress, the dog had chosen to cross the distance. Not because he was commanded, because he felt it. Ethan placed a hand slowly atop Echo's head. The fur was coarse but warm. Echo didn't flinch. The touch lasted only a moment. Then the dog turned and padded quietly back down the hall, disappearing into the dark like a phantom. But the imprint remained. Later that morning, under a now drenched sky, Ethan made a new entry in the notebook. Day 7. Nightmare. Rain. Echo approached. First contact, head to leg, no tail, no sound, just presence. It meant everything. Later that day, while finishing up laundry, Ethan's phone buzzed on the counter. The screen read, Maddie, ARC. He hesitated a moment before answering. Hey, came her familiar voice, warm and curious. Just checking in, wanted to see how it's going. Ethan leaned against the wall, slow, but not stagnant. Maddie chuckled softly. That's a better report than most of our adoptions. There was a pause. Then Ethan added, He touched me last night. You mean, like, actually? Yeah. Laid his head on my leg while I was not in a great place. Maddie's tone shifted quiet, but filled with a kind of reverence. That's huge, Ethan. I know. There was another moment of silence, this one less awkward than intentional. Maddie had always been a good listener, but there was something more in her quiet now, a growing sense of investment. Not just in the dog, but in the man holding the leash. You know, she said gently, dogs don't just reflect our pain. Sometimes they carry it for us. Maybe Echo. Maybe he needed to know someone had nightmares too. Ethan didn't reply immediately. He stared out the window at the rain, watched it slide down the glass in rivers. Maybe. From that point forward, Echo began to appear in unexpected places. He no longer hid in the laundry room all day. Some mornings, Ethan would find him lying quietly in the hallway, halfway between rooms. Once, when Ethan returned from chopping wood behind the cabin, he opened the door to find Echo sitting just inside Ear's perked tail, motionless but watching, present. The following Thursday, Ethan cooked scrambled eggs and left a bowl on the floor near Echo's new resting spot near the fireplace. Echo didn't rush over, but after Ethan turned away to wash the pan, he heard the soft clink of a bowl moving. Echo had eaten nearly half. Later that afternoon, Maddie called again. "How's the appetite?" she asked, skipping the pleasantries. "He's starting to sneak food when I'm not looking." Classic trauma response, Maddie replied. Test the space when no one's watching. Ethan smiled faintly. Sounds familiar. Their conversations began to stretch past Echo. Maddie shared that she'd grown up in Ashgrove, had once wanted to study veterinary medicine before her mother got sick. She stayed behind to care for her and never left. Her voice always held a note of compassion, edged with quiet fatigue, like someone who gave more than she ever asked for in return. Ethan found himself sharing too. Not everything, but enough. Afghanistan, his unit, the fire in the alley that never made the news, and his own return to silence, to sleep, broken by memory, to a world that didn't know what to do with a man who'd made it back, breathing, but not whole. And through it all, Echo followed. Not always closely, not always in step, but he was there, moving room to room with Ethan sitting nearby, while he read or repaired his old field knife. Once, while Ethan was mending a split fence board behind the shed, Echo appeared, sat a few feet away, and watched without sound. Just his presence was enough to fill the space between solitude and companionship. One evening, just before dusk, Ethan opened the front door to listen to the rain without the buffer of walls. Echo padded up beside him, paused, then laid down just at the threshold. Inside, but facing the storm. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The morning sun filtered through a thin veil of fog, painting the forest behind Ethan's cabin in soft gray light and dapples of gold. Ashgrove was quiet that day, wrapped in the kind of hush that came after 3 days of steady rain. The trees still dripped. The earth smelled of wet cedar and pine, and the trail that looped behind Ethan's property had turned soft and forgiving underfoot. It was the first truly dry morning in a week, and something in the air felt gently expectant, like a breath being held. Ethan stood at the edge of the trees, his jacket zipped to his throat, a worn leash coiled loosely in his hand. Beside him, Echo sat quietly, body tense but not retreating. The dog's posture had changed these last few days, still cautious but alert in a new way, as if some dormant thread had begun to pull taut inside him. His fur had started to regain its sheen, and though the scars along his muzzle and flank remained, they no longer defined his presence. Ethan looked down. "You ready?" he asked softly. Echo didn't respond, but he didn't pull away either. They stepped into the forest. The trail behind the cabin was narrow, carved years ago by deer and worn smooth by boots. Ethan used to walk it daily after moving in until the woods stopped feeling like peace and started echoing with memories he couldn't outrun. Today, though, he moved slowly, letting the sounds of the forest take shape around them, the rustle of wind through fir branches, the wet crackle of needles beneath boots, the distant call of a morning dove. Echo kept pace at his side, not at heel but near. They didn't speak. The rhythm of shared silence had become familiar. About 20 minutes, and the trees opened to a small clearing framed by sword ferns and a moss-covered log that had long since fallen. Ethan stopped to breathe. Echo stood beside him, ears twitching at distant sounds, eyes scanning the underbrush. Then, abruptly, a sharp crack rang out, a branch snapping not far off the trail. Ethan stiffened. The sound pulled a memory through him like a thread yanked too fast a dry twig in a desert night the moment before a firefight. His hand went instinctively to his side, though there was no weapon there. Echo froze too, hackles rising, body stiffening like coiled wire. For a second, Ethan expected the dog to bolt to dive for cover or flee into the underbrush. Instead, Echo stepped forward. He positioned himself between Ethan and the source of the sound. His body was low ears, pressed back lips, slightly curled in a quiet warning. He didn't bark. He didn't whimper. He simply growled a low rumbling sound that felt older than language. Protective. Present. Ethan stared. The branch crack turned out to be nothing, just a deer spooked bounding through the brush with its white tail flashing. But it didn't matter. The moment had already happened. Echo had chosen to stand between. They walked home in silence. This time, Echo didn't trail behind or hover at a distance. He stayed close, occasionally brushing Ethan's leg with his side. Back at the cabin, Ethan wrote in the notebook with shaking hands. Day 10. Walk the woods. Echo stood between me and danger. Growled not in fear, in defense. First sign of instinct returning. Not hiding anymore, protecting. That afternoon, as Ethan raked the sodden leaves from his gravel path, an old voice called out from the property line. Didn't think I'd see you in the woods again. Ethan looked up to see Walter Hensley, his neighbor from 2 cabins down, leaning on the split-rail fence. Walter was in his 70s, tall and wiry, with a slight stoop that years in forestry hadn't taken from him, but had softened. His face was lined but good-natured, framed by a flannel shirt tucked into old canvas work pants. A knife hung in a worn leather sheath at his belt, not as a threat, just a habit. Walter had worked as a forest ranger for over 30 years and retired in Ash Grove to grow tomatoes and read military biographies on his porch. I go where the dog goes now, Ethan said, tossing another pile of leaves. Walter tilted his head toward Echo, who stood silently behind Ethan, one paw still in midair, watching the stranger with cautious interest. That's the shepherd they called Echo, right? Walter asked. Ethan nodded. You know him. Not personally, but Maddie talks. She's a good girl, that one. Kind-hearted, too kind sometimes. Walter stepped forward, squinting at Echo. You've got yourself a rare one. He's still figuring it out, Ethan replied. Walter gave a slow nod, then looked out toward the trees. You know, my brother used to work K-9 units out in Montana. One day, one of the dogs bit a suspect and they decided it was too risky to keep. Ordered him to be put down. Ethan frowned. What happened, my brother drove 6 hours overnight and forged papers to get that dog transferred to a sanctuary. Said no dog trained to protect should be killed for doing his job. Walter smiled faintly. That dog lived another 5 years in peace, and never bit again. Just needed to believe someone still believed in him. Ethan's throat tightened. Walter stepped back. Anyway, figured I'd say hello. Storm's coming tonight. You two keep dry. Ethan nodded. You too, Walter. As the older man walked away, Echo took a cautious step toward the fence, sniffed the air, then retreated behind Ethan again. But he didn't hide, not this time. Later that evening, Ethan placed a new entry into the log. Day 10 continued, met Walter. Echo watched him from behind me but didn't run. First time he didn't retreat, stayed in place. A new kind of stillness. Alert, not afraid. Outside, the wind stirred the forest. But inside, the quiet felt different now, less like silence, more like trust. The news spread through Ash Grove like a gust of wind through dry leaves, quiet at first, then frantic. A little girl, Lila Thompson, 9 years old, had gone missing the evening before. Her bike was found at the edge of Elkshade Park, abandoned near the trailhead that led into the forest. No sign of a struggle, no note. Just silence, and Ash Grove, a town small enough that everyone knew everyone else's middle name, held its collective breath. Ethan heard it first on the local radio while making breakfast, bacon popping in the skillet, coffee brewing. Echo lay nearby, ears perked. The broadcaster's voice was urgent, but composed the way small-town anchors tried to mask the gravity behind protocol. Local authorities are searching the woods surrounding Elkshade Park this morning after the disappearance of Lila Thompson, a 9-year-old girl last seen leaving her home on Hawthorne Lane around 5:30 p.m. She was wearing a yellow raincoat and carrying a red backpack. Volunteers are encouraged to gather at the firehouse for coordination. Ethan froze spatula in hand. He glanced down at Echo, who had already risen, body tense, nose lifted slightly, as if he too understood something had shifted in the air. By late morning, Ethan decided to take Echo for their usual walk, partly to keep the dog moving, partly to clear the fog of dread that had settled behind his ribs. They kept to their familiar trail, less overgrown now, after repeated walks moving at a steady, quiet pace. But barely 15 minutes into the woods, something in Echo changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in posture, a narrowing of his eyes. His steps grew shorter, more cautious. Then he stopped entirely. His nose worked the air, head tilting left, then sharply right. Without warning, he let out a deep, urgent bark, louder than Ethan had ever heard from him. Another followed. Then he tugged hard on the leash. "Echo, wait, what is it?" But Echo was already pulling determined, tracking something Ethan couldn't see. His body was alert, tail high, strides purposeful. Ethan didn't resist. He dropped the leash but kept pace. Heart thudding. They veered off trail, Echo weaving through ferns and low-hanging branches, like he knew exactly where to go. He barked again, shorter now, more rhythmic, and Ethan recognized the pattern. Not panic, not fear, calling, a signal. Elsewhere in town, Maddie had just finished organizing bottled water and energy bars for search volunteers at the shelter when her coworker, a short, pink-cheeked woman named Jamie, stepped in with a flyer. Maddie didn't need to read it. She'd already memorized Lila's photo from the alert shared that morning. A smiling girl with a gap-toothed grin, braids, and a sunflower clip. Maddie felt the cold weight of dread coil in her stomach. "I'm heading out there," she told Jamie, grabbing her rain jacket. "You sure?" Jamie asked, concerned. "The police have it under control. Sheriff Miller's even called in the state dogs." "I know," Maddie said. "But Ethan has Echo with him. If Echo picks up something, I don't know. I just need to be there." Jamie didn't argue. She knew Maddie's instincts had always leaned toward action, especially since her younger brother had gone missing for 3 hours in the woods a decade ago. A story that ended with a happy ending, but left Maddie with an unshakable urgency when it came to children and silence. Back in the forest, Echo surged forward. They were deep now, far past the usual loops branches, scraping Ethan's arms boots, slipping on moss-covered rock. Echo stopped at a fork of narrow deer paths and sniffed hard, then turned left, barking again. Then a red flash caught Ethan's eye. A small ribbon frayed at one end caught on a thorn bush. Red with tiny white polka dots. The kind a child might wear in her hair. Ethan snatched it gently, fingers trembling. "Good boy," he whispered. Echo barked once, softer this time, almost as if to say yes, keep going. They pressed on. The terrain sloped downward. Echo's gait never faltered. The forest thickened, and the air grew cooler, damper. Then came the faintest sound, barely more than a whimper. Ethan's breath caught. Echo bolted toward the noise slipping through a thicket. Ethan followed, heart pounding in his throat. There, in a small hollow beneath a fallen tree, curled in a yellow raincoat darkened with dirt and damp leaves, was Lila. Her knees were pulled to her chest, face, pale eyes half-lidded. Her backpack was nowhere to be seen. Ethan dropped beside her. "Lila," he asked, gently shaking her shoulder, "can you hear me?" Her lips moved, cracked and quiet. "Cold." Ethan wrapped his jacket around her small frame and scooped her into his arms. She was too light. Echo hovered close, whining softly, licking her hand once. Lila blinked at the dog. "Wolf," she whispered. Ethan smiled through the tightness in his chest. "No. Friend." With Echo leading the way, back up the path, Ethan carried the girl toward the sound of distant voices, search teams now fanning out toward the deeper woods. Minutes later, they emerged into the clearing where 3 volunteers, including Maddie, were calling Lila's name. Maddie spotted them first. "Ethan!" She gasped, racing forward. Her eyes flicked to Lila's small frame in his arms, to the way Echo stood beside them like a sentry carved from loyalty. "Call the paramedics," Ethan said. "She's alive." Maddie nodded, fumbling for her radio with shaking hands, eyes shining. Echo didn't move from Lila's side. The morning after Lila's rescue, Ash Grove stirred with a cautious kind of relief. Flyers were peeled from telephone poles, volunteers returned their flashlights and walkie-talkies to the firehouse, and Sheriff Mason gave a short, solemn statement to the local paper. The town had come through a storm, and for once the ending wasn't a headline soaked in grief. But not all questions had answers. Ethan stood near the edge of the trailhead, his boots caked in dried mud from the previous day's frantic run through the forest. Echo sat beside him, calm but alert, his amber eyes flicking between tree lines, ears twitching at every small crack of branch or rustle of wind. Maddie was a few feet away, speaking with a new face a woman Ethan didn't recognize, leaning over a topographical map splayed out on the hood of a rescue jeep. The woman's name was Tanya Brooke, a 27-year-old wildlife specialist newly assigned to the Regional Conservation Initiative. She stood about 5'8", lean and sharply postured with sun-faded freckles and thick blonde hair tied into a tight utilitarian ponytail. Her face bore the kind of focus forged by years in unpredictable terrain. Though young, there was a steadiness to her, the kind that didn't flinch when plans went sideways. Tanya had worked with rescue dogs before in Montana during rockslide recovery efforts, and she had a habit of taking notes on a weatherproof field pad tucked in the breast pocket of her orange vest. "You're Ethan, right?" she asked without looking up from her notes. Her voice was clear, professional. "Yeah, that's Echo," she added, glancing at the dog now standing just behind Ethan's leg. "He is. He's got something," she said matter-of-factly. "Yesterday wasn't luck." Ethan didn't respond. Echo sat again, tail still, eyes on the woods like a sentry guarding memory. Sheriff Mason had requested a secondary sweep of the forest, not because Lila's rescue was in doubt, but because certain items like her backpack still hadn't been recovered. More troubling were the deep, claw-like marks found on the trail's edge, which raised concerns about predators. Tanya had been called in to consult and document any animal's activity. "I'd like to bring Echo with us today," Tanya said, flipping a page. "We'll be slow, cautious. His familiarity with the scene could lead us to overlooked evidence." Ethan nodded, already expecting the request. "He goes where I go." "Good," she replied. "We move in 5." They set off into the trees again, this time not in a panic, but with focused precision. The forest had changed, at least for Ethan. What had once been a quiet backdrop for his private healing now felt like a place charged with consequence. Echo led without being told, nose to the wind body, moving like memory through the underbrush. 20 minutes in, Echo stopped. He sniffed the base of a tree, then looked upward, ears straight. body still. Ethan followed his gaze. A red and black backpack hung precariously from a crooked branch snagged in the split of a forked pine about 7 feet off the ground. It was partially torn open, the zipper broken, one strap hanging limp. Below it, the bark of the tree bore deep vertical grooves, as though something large and clawed had scraped its way upward. Maddie caught up, her face shifting from curiosity to tension the moment she saw the pack. "Is that hers?" Ethan asked. She pulled out a laminated photo from her back pocket, one she'd kept since the start of the search. The charm, dangling from the zipper shaped like a yellow duck, matched perfectly. Tanya stepped forward, careful not to disturb the ground. She crouched beside the marks and inspected them with a flashlight. "These aren't made by a deer or coyote," she muttered. "Depth-width angle. Too aggressive. Possibly a bobcat, but the height—" She looked at Echo, who stood silently growling low under his breath, as his gaze remained locked on the gouges. "He knows it's still around," Ethan said quietly. "Maybe," Tanya replied. She scribbled a few notes, snapped photos, and then stood. Either way, this confirms Lila wasn't just lost. She was running. Silence settled. Even the birds seemed to have left the area. Back at the trailhead, as Tanya cataloged her findings, Maddie lingered near the Jeep arms folded. She watched Ethan rub Echo's ears gently, the bond between them, unspoken but solid like the earth they stood on. Tanya approached her with a clipboard. "He's incredible," she said, gesturing toward Echo. "Untrained yet responsive. Reads terrain and energy like a working dog." "He's not a tool," Maddie replied softly. "No, of course not," Tanya said, tone softening. "But we're launching a search and support pilot program next quarter. Community-based. Half-trained dogs with high natural instinct. We could use a pair like them." Maddie hesitated. "You'd be taking him away from Ethan," she said flatly. "No. Ethan would be part of the program too. Paid, integrated. His background fits. I just think they're more than healing each other. They're capable of helping others." Maddie didn't respond, but the conflict bloomed quietly in her chest. She was proud of Echo, proud of Ethan. But the thought of pushing them into something new, something structured, felt premature. What if it pulled apart the fragile roots they'd only just begun to grow? As Tanya packed up her gear, Echo looked back into the woods once more, and growled quieter now, like a memory, still watching from the shadows. The first photo appeared on the front page of the Ash Grove Sentinel, framed beneath the headline, "From Forgotten to Hero Shelter, Dog Saves Missing Girl." Echo's amber eyes stared out from the image caught mid-turn beside Ethan, who stood with a neutral expression in front of the firehouse. The photo had been taken without him noticing, but it didn't matter. Ethan didn't read the article. He tossed the paper on the porch table and sat on the steps with a mug of coffee going cold in his hands. Echo lay beside him, chin resting on the top step-tail curled around his hind legs like a sentinel at rest. The wind that morning carried the crisp bite of October brushing dried leaves across the yard like whispers. Ethan's flannel shirt flapped softly as he exhaled, not from anxiety, not even fatigue, but a strange new feeling he hadn't tasted in years. Ease. Echo, though alert, didn't tense at every passing noise now. The way he lay mirrored Ethan's stillness. They had begun to breathe the same air, move to the same rhythm. Over the next few days, the media stories multiplied. The Oregonian ran a full spread with the headline, "The Dog No One Wanted," became "The Dog Who Wouldn't Give Up." TV crews showed up near the trailhead hoping to film the hero dog. Ethan declined every interview. He didn't mind the attention falling on Echo, but the idea of stepping back into the spotlight, of being asked to retell the moment again and again, made his chest tighten. Still, the impact was real. Letters began arriving at the cabin, most addressed to Echo the Wonder Dog, with crooked handwriting and stickers from elementary classrooms across the state. One envelope included a hand-drawn card in pink crayon. "Thank you for saving the girl Echo. I wish you were my dog." Another came from a veteran support group in Bend, along with a pamphlet for a PTSD recovery retreat. Ethan didn't open that one right away. That evening, as he split kindling for the stove, the familiar sound of tires on gravel turned his head. Maddie's rust-colored Subaru pulled up gently, and she stepped out holding a large folder, the sleeves of her green hoodie pushed to her elbows. She wore her hair in a loose braid that hung over her shoulder, and her boots were still muddy from the morning's shift. "I come bearing art." She smiled, lifting the folder. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What is it?" "It's from Lila. Her mom dropped it off this morning. She said Lila hasn't stopped drawing since she got home. Most of them are of Echo." Echo perked up at the sound of his name. Maddie crouched beside him and gave his head a gentle rub, which he accepted with a soft thump of his tail. She opened the folder and handed Ethan a thick sheet of paper. It was a drawing done in bold marker strokes, childlike but strangely moving. Echo was drawn with angel wings standing on a hill beside a small girl in a yellow raincoat. The sun had a smiling face. Above their heads were the words, "My guardian." Ethan stared at it longer than he meant to. His throat tightened. He began, then stopped. "You don't have to say anything," Maddie said, her voice gentle. "Just thought you should see what you both meant to her." Ethan nodded slowly. "Want to stay for dinner?" he asked suddenly. Maddie blinked, caught off guard. "Sure, if you're sure. I'm sure," he said already, turning toward the door. "I make a mean chili. Might not win awards, but it'll warm your bones." Inside the cabin, the space felt different. The fireplace crackled warmly, casting dancing light across the wood-paneled walls. There were still signs of Echo everywhere, claw marks on the back door frame, a well-worn blanket near the hearth, but instead of looking like damage, it looked like life. While the chili simmered, they sat at the small kitchen table. Maddie talked about the shelter, about Jamie, mixing up medication labels again, about a cat named Sheriff who had taken over the front desk chair and refused to move. Ethan listened, nodded, even smiled. Not the polite kind, real ones. Full. Over dinner, they avoided heavier topics. Maddie didn't bring up Tanya's program or the articles in the paper. Ethan didn't mention the pamphlet sitting unopened on his desk. It wasn't time for that. After the meal, Maddie stood in the doorway, ready to leave. She looked back once more at Ethan and Echo sitting side by side near the fireman and dog shadows dancing behind them like echoes of something almost holy. "I'm glad you found each other," she said. Ethan met her eyes. "So am I." Echo gave a soft huff, as if in agreement. The first time Echo entered the hall of the Veteran Rehabilitation Center in Tillamook, his paws clicked quietly against the linoleum floor, each step careful and measured. Ethan walked beside him, not in front, not behind. Just beside an unspoken agreement they'd grown into over the last few months. The decision to register Echo for therapy training hadn't come quickly. It began with a quiet moment, the drawing Lila had made, still pinned to the cabin wall. Ethan would often glance at it while sipping coffee or scribbling thoughts in the notebook he no longer needed to track Echo's fear. Now it held reflections, thoughts, ideas. And slowly an understanding grew. Echo's healing wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of something they could give away. They enrolled in a regional therapy dog certification program run by a retired trauma nurse named Carla Mendoza. Carla was in her early 60s, petite but fiery, with silver-streaked black hair tied in a knot, glasses always perched at the end of her nose, and an unapologetic love for dogs. She had worked 3 decades in military hospitals before dedicating her retirement to pairing therapy animals with people suffering trauma. She walked with a slight limp from a car accident 10 years prior, but carried herself with purpose and a clipboard that never left her side. Echo's got a story in his eyes, she said on their first day. Most of the good ones do. The training was slow, precise, built on trust. Echo had to learn not just how to stay calm in chaotic environments, but how to approach people, especially those in pain. There were moments he faltered, flinching at sharp sounds, pausing near certain types of uniforms. But each time Ethan was there. Not with commands, with presence. Echo learned to sit beside wheelchairs without fear, to press gently against legs, trembling with withdrawal or grief. His instincts, shaped by survival, were now used to steady others. At one children's therapy session, a 6-year-old girl named Penny Tiny, with curly black hair and a patch over one eye, refused to speak to anyone. She sat alone in the corner of the room with a stuffed rabbit clutched in her arms. But Echo padded toward her, slowly lay down, and inched forward until his nose touched her shoelaces. She blinked once, then reached out and brushed her fingers over his fur. By the end of the session, she whispered, "Can he come back tomorrow?" He did. Ethan watched these moments with quiet awe. He had started the program hoping Echo could help others, but he hadn't expected how much it would help him. Every visit to the rehab center chipped away at the wall he'd lived behind for years. Echo opened doors not just in others but in Ethan's own memory, softening the sharp edges of things long buried. At night in the cabin, the journal pages multiplied. But now, instead of noting behavioral patterns or nightmares, Ethan wrote stories. Stories of Echo's first touch, the way he stood between him and the broken branch in the forest, the way he had growled not from fear, but from instinct. These pages became something else, a manuscript. He titled it, "Second Chances: A Soldier and His Dog." It wasn't a book about war, not really. It was about silence, about shadows, and about what happens when two broken creatures decide to stand beside each other long enough to mend. When the draft was finished, Ethan printed a single copy at the little office store on Main Street. He placed it in a simple craft paper envelope, tied it with twine, and wrote in small, steady letters on the front to Maddie. He left it at the shelter desk one morning before opening hours. Inside the front cover was a handwritten note. "Thank you for not giving up on him. And thank you for not giving up on me." Maddie found it an hour later. She sat on the break room bench, still in her shelter hoodie and rubber boots, and read the whole thing in silence. When she reached the last page, she turned it over, then hugged the manuscript to her chest and wiped her eyes on her sleeve. Echo and Ethan became familiar faces at the center. People began referring to them as the pair from Ashgrove. Photos of Echo lying with veterans during group sessions circulated on local social media pages. A regional mental health nonprofit offered Ethan a small contract to visit monthly. He accepted, not for the paycheck, but because it felt right. Back at the cabin, nothing flashy changed. The fires still crackled the same way in the hearth. The trees still sang when the wind curled through them. But the silence inside the walls had changed. It was no longer the silence of memory. It was the silence of peace. One chilly evening near the end of the year, Ethan and Echo sat on the porch. The stars were beginning to prick through the dark, and somewhere far off an owl called out. Echo rested his head on Ethan's boot content. Ethan spoke softly, almost to himself. "You did good, buddy." Echo blinked up at him. No bark, no tail wag, just quiet agreement. Sometimes the greatest miracles come not in thunder or light, but in the quiet footsteps of a wounded dog and the broken man who learns to walk beside him. Echo was never just a shelter dog. He was a reminder that even when the world turns its back, healing is possible. That God can use the forgotten, the cast aside, the hurting, to bring light into the darkest places. In a world that often rushes past pain, this story teaches us to slow down, to listen, to believe that second chances are not only real, but sacred. Because grace doesn't always roar, it sometimes walks on 4 quiet paws. If you've ever felt abandoned, overlooked, or lost in the shadows, may this story be your sign that God still sees you. He is still writing your story. Drop a comment below with Amen if you believe in second chances. Share this video to bless someone who may need it today. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true stories of hope and healing. May God bless you and everyone you love.